So those are timber harvesting systems. Something we're going to get into now is a topic that if you continue on in the forestry program here at Haywood Community College, you're going to hear a lot more about it. But we're just going to touch on it really briefly here. It's the water quality regulations in North Carolina as they relate to timber harvesting and forestry operations. The protection of water quality and soil quality it's a primary concern in North Carolina during harvesting. In fact, the only regulations that actually exist in terms of forestry operations are water quality regulations. There's different states that have regulations regarding the type of silviculture that you can use, how big clear cuts can be, what sort of tree, what type of trees and how many trees need to be left behind after harvesting. And there are no regulations like that in North Carolina. There are no silvicultural regulations, but there are water quality regulations, things that that must be adhered to maintain a logging job that's in compliance. A lot of what they deal with are things like road and skid trail placement, landing placement, and provisions for closing out your harvesting operation. The first thing that we need to get established here is the difference between the Forest Practices Guidelines, what are referred to as FPGs, and the Forestry Best Management Practices, BMPs. The regulations, the water quality regulations in North Carolina are referred to as the Forest Practices Guidelines related to water quality. They are 9 separate guidelines that must be followed to remain in compliance with the law. In addition to those FPGs, there are numerous BMPs, best management practices, that have been established by in sort of a multi-stakeholder process that are really just suggestions to help you remain in compliance as a forestry operation. On the slide here, is an image of the best management practices manual in North Carolina. It's actually a copy of mine. So this book is a couple hundred pages. It gives you all sorts of advice, lays out all sorts of different techniques to remain in compliance with the Forest Practices Guidelines. So BMPs are voluntary things, but being in compliance with the Forest Practices Guidelines are not voluntary. So the idea is it's a whole host of management practices that you can employ to remain in compliance. And so these are the guidelines right here. These are the FPGs related to water quality. And that water quality part of it is really important because, again, that's all these guidelines are in reference to. They've all been designed to protect stream quality and protect water quality. And so just running down the list, 201 states that you will maintain a proper streamside management zone. Your riparian buffer, the vegetation that you leave on the margins of intermittent and perennial streams must be of a sufficient width to keep sediment out of the stream, to keep accelerated erosion as a result of the logging job from moving sediment into the stream. The FPGs don't tell you exactly how wide it needs to be, they just say it needs to be effective. So it needs to be wide enough to keep the sediment out. 202 refers to woody debris in streams and water bodies. You can't have tops and limbs left in a stream. It can result in flooding. It can result in altering the hydrology of the stream. And so that's also something that is accounted for in the FPGs. 203 and 204 deal with access roads and skid trail crossings. What these amount to is that any road you put in, any road that a logger uses, any skid trail that's established, particularly ones that cross streams, cannot result in sediment entering the streams. They must be installed and maintained appropriately so you don't have sedimentation as a result. 205 prohibits waste from entering streams, and so these are things like oil and fuel, all the stuff you'd find around heavy machinery. you can't have leaks, right? You can't have equipment leaks that end up putting oil in a water body or hydraulic fluid in a water body. That would be a violation as well. 206 and 207 deal with pesticide and fertilizer application. You can't have an adverse effect on water quality as a result of the utilization of pesticides or fertilizers in forestry operations. So these are two that don't necessarily deal with harvesting, but these are oftentimes pesticides, and less common, but sometimes fertilizers are applied during forestry operations. They can't have an adverse impact on streams either. 208 deals with stream temperature, in particular keeping cool streams cool. It's a big concern with trout habitat, particularly in the mountains. That amounts to maintaining an adequate canopy cover around the stream. And 209 is the rehabilitation of the project site. This is job closeout. When you leave the job, when the logging operation's over, everything needs to be stabilized. There can be no future risk of erosion because something hasn't been revegetated or something hasn't been closed out appropriately. These next few slides just illustrate some of the BMPs that are utilized to maintain compliance with the FPGs. This is an example here of a properly installed water bar across a skid trail. Utilizing properly installed water bars in sufficient number on a skid trail is a great way to divert water flow off of the skid trail so it doesn't carry sediment from the skid trail into the water body below. This is another example of a water bar with a pretty wide turnout. So again, what you're trying to do is to divert the flow of water off the skid trail and to also slow the velocity of the water down. This minimizes the amount of erosion that occurs and also keeps the water from carrying sediment down below into a water body. Another really effective BMP is the use of a bridge mat to cross a stream. This is opposed to using a culvert or installing a culvert. When you place a culvert in a stream, you end up having to move dirt around, right adjacent to the stream. You can't help but cause some amount of sedimentation during that process. And then you have to wait for it to stabilize before, with vegetation, or you stabilize it with rock before you can actually use it. By utilizing a bridge, just laying a bridge down of sufficient length across the channel, then you're really not, aside from the skid trail, the adjacent skid trail, you're really not having to disturb all that much. And so this is another way to remain in compliance with the FPGs, to keep sediment out of the stream. And this is just sort of a side view of a properly installed bridge, where you have a bridge mat that kind of goes from bank to bank, and you also have water diversions, up on either side of the approaches. Again, this is all these BMPs are meant to keep sediment out of the stream, out of the creek. Okay, and so this image here is meant to illustrate the use of riparian buffers. And so what we have here is a pretty substantial harvest in what looks like a pretty mountainous area of Burke County. And so kind of the fingers of vegetation that you see left in there are along perennial or intermittent streams. And so you can tell as it gets kind of further down the drainage that SMZ, that streamside management zone, gets wider, because you obviously have more, a larger water course further downstream. And so a pretty dramatic example of the use of riparian buffers, but I think it gives you guys an idea of how that could work. Okay, and the last slide just shows a properly closed out forest road. You have the soil that was disturbed on either side of it has been revegetated and stabilized. So over time, there's no chance that that's going to erode and again end up in an adjacent water body. So one of the most important FPGs is that a job is properly closed out, because if it isn't, then it's just a perpetual problem, right? If it's not properly closed out, and there's always that risk of erosion occurring and sedimentation occurring. So it's an important thing to keep in mind.